Hey, my name is Hunter Christensen, and this is Prompted, the official podcast of the Writing Prompts section on Reddit.com, where you are prompted to write stories, and here we showcase the best of them. All of this with the goal of helping each other become better writers. Welcome back to another episode. Apologies for the extra week break. I've been busy working like a dog so that I can, live. And of course do this. But you all know how that is because that's life. We all need food and shelter and the newest smartphone. And if we want these things in our lives, we have to live something of a second life. And well, that's our job. This second life is the topic of today's show. We will explore stories across a number of professions to get a glimpse into how different characters navigate the world that is their work life. Our first story takes a job that is typically mundane and boring and tells it through the eyes of a character who is a noir detective. I like the library. It's so quiet you could hear a mute talk. But in here, as in the city, there's always trouble. I start my day the way I always do. E-cig, a cup of coffee, and a sandwich. This one's sausage and egg with malted bread. Changes every day. A man needs flexibility in this job. It's during the fifth bite that I hear it. Kids laughing. Anywhere else it'd be welcome. But here, it's about as welcome as a fist to the jaw. I head out from the desk. Sounds like it's coming from the fiction section. Probably crime. I take my usual route, outer ring, and arrive on the scene. I'm already too late. The victim's face down on the floor. Dixon Hill PI, Volume 2, according to the spine. Slightly damaged dust jacket, no marks. I bend down to pick it up, and as I turn it over I see what the bastards have done. As clear as a hooker at church. Dixon Hill now has a mustache. Blue. Probably Bureau. It'll be near impossible to get that off now. It doesn't look like I'm going to find out who did it either. They did the deed and left faster than a goose after bread. I know they're kids though, and they must have signed in with their card, otherwise they couldn't get in. It's a start, I guess. It's when I lifted the book up to put it back that I see the real crime. Where the book was, there's now a gaping hole. On either side, there should have been Dixon Hill P.I. Volume 1 and Dixon Hill P.I. Volume 3. Instead, there's the YA novel Angst Abound and the new Dan Brown novel Lincoln's Last Regret. The other two Dixon Hill P.I. volumes are nowhere to be found. I suspect they've replaced these two books. Clever idea. I spend the next 10 minutes replacing the books back to where they each belong. It's slow work, and I can feel the rage bubbling beneath the surface. I'm like a lobster in the pot, and I can feel my face reddening with each step and hear a high-pitched, quiet whine escape my lips. Those bastards. I get back to my desk. A sip of now tepid coffee only fuels my anger. My sandwich is now unappetizing and like ash in my mouth, and I throw it away. My e-cig helps, the distinct vanilla essence filling my mouth and lungs. I sit down at the computer, my shirt tightening, and open up the sign-in records for the day. Only 4 individuals under the age of 15 have been in the library today. Of those, only 2 were over 6 years. I've read the names. Gary McCormick and Geoffrey Rose. My lips twist into a smirk. Gotcha, you little bastards. I note down their addresses and begin the process of writing letters to their parents. There are only 3 things I hate in my library. Defacement of library property, ignorance of the Dewey Decimal System, and misplacement of library property. These little bastards have done 2 out of 3. How long until they do the 3rd? Not in my library. Not on my watch. That story was written by Chaldera. The next story we have gives us a glimpse into the life of an open-heart surgeon, but with one twist. The prompt that inspired it was, write a story about something that you don't understand. Do no research, make up everything as you go. All right, Dr. Cameron. It appears that the patient is going to need a triple bypass if they're going to live, Dr. Erickson casually quipped over a lukewarm cup of joe. It did indeed appear that the patient was having a difficult time with getting his poor heart to cooperate with him, as he had apparently recently taken to participating in butter drinking competitions all around the United States. I thought to myself for a moment, then replied, "Yeah, I guess so. Probably time to move him to the ER." The patient had been very unconscious for the past 15 minutes or so. The patient was strapped to a gurney and transported from the waiting room and wheeled into an operating room by a team of medical personnel. It was about 3 a.m., and all of the staff were nearing exhaustion. I followed the rest of the nurses to the operating room soon after, and Dr. Erickson was sipping his coffee right next to the operating table. As a wave of tiredness came over me, I had to strain myself mentally to remember my medical training, lest this man die on my table. All right, first step. Yeah, I think I should probably wash my hands so I don't give him an infection. As I scrubbed my hands, Dr. Erickson put his gloves on and pulled out his tray of surgical instruments. "Ready, doctor?" he asked me through his surgical mask. "Yep, as long as I stay awake," I reply. Tonight was going to be a long night. I put my latex gloves on, and as I approached the table I saw that the patient was fully prepared for me, ready to go. First, I asked the nurse for a scalpel and made a vertical incision about 8 inches long above the sternum. And this is exactly where I forgot what I was supposed to do. Embarrassed, I asked Dr. Erickson, "So, remember back to medical school? If I were testing you now, what would you say the next step would be?" I guess it would help to get through the rib cage," Dr. Erickson replied. "I think there's probably a hacksaw for that around here somewhere." It became apparent to me then that Dr. Erickson was under the same spell of fatigue that I was. He began clanking around a few drawers looking for the saw when a nurse began to ask, "Hey doctor, aren't you supposed to—" "Quiet, nurse," I interjected. I wasn't about to have some undereducated peon lecture me on how to do my job. The clanking stopped, and Dr. Erickson looked up from his drawer. "Found one!" he exclaimed as he held it high. A rusted hacksaw covered in white paint chips, clearly last used for woodworking. I replied to the doctor, "Well, it'll have to do, I guess." The nurses were all giving each other terrified glances at this point, but must have been afraid to say anything else. I took the saw from Dr. Erickson, and as I was about to begin, I remembered something rather important. "Dr. Erickson, have you administered anesthesia yet?" I asked. The patient was unconscious for now, but probably wouldn't remain that way if I had begun my violent assault on his sternum. "Oops," was his only reply. He strolled over to the medicine cabinet and grabbed a bottle of morphine. He inserted a syringe into the bottle and drew the plunger to about 30 milliliters. "This'll do," he remarked to himself. The morphine was injected intravenously, and the operation proceeded. The sternum was hard to make it through with the hacksaw, but 5 minutes in elbow grease are enough to saw through mostly anything. I didn't remember what the device to hold the ribcage open was called, and I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of these dumbass nurses again, so I told one of them to keep the ribcage open by holding the halves apart with their hands. Now I could see the bottom tip of the heart beneath the patient's lungs, still mostly inaccessible, so I cut the connective tissue keeping the lungs in place and spread them out to the sides like wings. Unfortunately, the lungs weren't functioning anymore. "You, nurse, get one of those things that you pump into his mouth so he can breathe," I ordered. "Oh, what?" the obviously horrified and anxious nurse replied. Unable to remember what the device was called, I sighed and said, "Just perform mouth-to-mouth for the remainder of the procedure." At this point, the area around the table was beginning to become crowded with nurses crawling all over this poor man to keep his ribs open and to keep him breathing. I looked to check the EKG to see if his vitals were still good, at which point I realized that I forgot to connect one. I ordered the nurses to set one up, and after everything was set up, I noticed his blood pressure was very low. "We're going to need to give this man a blood transfusion," I stated. "Dr. Erickson, would you be so kind to set up the transfusion?" "Sure thing," he replied. Taking a bag of O-negative out of the freezer, he thawed it under his armpit for a couple of minutes and then inserted it into the IV, commanding a nurse to hold the bag up and let gravity do the rest of the work. After a few minutes, blood pressure began to return to normal. With his heart exposed, the real operation could begin. At this moment, I remembered that a bypass surgery involved taking veins from the legs and using them to bypass the clots, but I could not for the life of me remember which veins to take. From the look on Dr. Erickson's face, he couldn't either. Attempting to save face, I asked Dr. Erickson, "Would you be so kind as to perform the vessel removal from this patient's left leg?" He turned bright red and began to look around the room. "Me? Now?" I just stared at him for a minute. "Fine." He grabbed a scalpel and cut into the patient's left leg and removed a 6-inch segment of the largest vessel he could find, and what remained of it began to bleed profusely. I had no idea what to do at this point. I was just too tired. "Well, crap, I guess we'll have to amputate. I don't think we can save that leg." The nurses obviously didn't agree with what was going on, with their judgmental, wide-eyed stares and heavy breathing. They weren't the ones holding the scalpel, so they could piss off for all I cared. I took the hacksaw from before and went to work. The leg was faster to come off than the sternum. However, it was also bleeding much more heavily. I ordered another nurse to throw another bag of O-negative and squeeze. I couldn't remember the rest of the amputation procedure, but I remembered back to an episode of The Walking Dead that I saw in Season 1 where some redneck cut off his own hand to escape some handcuffs and sear it with a hot pan, cauterizing the wound. I elected to go with this procedure. We threw the leg into the biohazard bag, as it probably couldn't be reattached and we already had the vein we needed. I cut it into 3 sections, one for each of the vessels that we needed to bypass. Then another reality hit me. I had forgotten which 3 of the 4 vessels needed to be bypassed. A cold sweat came over me. My vision began to tunnel. I'd done goofed. I can't even remember how to test for which ones needed the bypass. Time to wing it, I guess. I decided to go with vessels 1, 2, and 4 because of a video I saw with 3 numbered escaped greased pigs that I saw earlier, with the prank being that number 3 one was non-existent and people would keep looking for it. I cut small holes on either side of where I believe a clot would be and attached the veins with my trusty tube of Elmer's superglue. Monitoring the patient's vitals, it appeared that it worked, since some of the numbers began shifting around and it wasn't beeping at me. I glanced at Cameron, who gave me a wink and a thumbs up. I knew that 2 doctors couldn't possibly be wrong, so everything must be going well. Only 3 nurses left during the procedure, 2 of them due to physical exhaustion from holding the patient's ribs open and 1 due to a bout of unconsciousness. Must have been too squeamish to assist during the open heart surgery. They shouldn't have even been allowed to graduate med school. I placed the lungs back to their native position and used superglue in place of where I made the earlier incisions to disconnect them. I relieved the rib holder nurse of duty and stapled the sternum back together. I asked Dr. Erickson to finish sewing the patient back up while I removed my gloves and washed my hands. After taking one last look at his vitals and determining that they probably looked fine, I ordered the nurses to bring the patient to a recovery room where he would remain until he woke, at which point he would be sent home. Due to reasons unknown to me, none of them responded, or even looked in my direction for that matter. They cleaned the blood off the patient and wheeled him out. Sighing a sigh of relief, I turned to Dr. Erickson. "Just another day on the job, right?" "Yep, I guess we'll see what tomorrow brings." "We sure will." Dr. Erickson and I donned our coats and returned to the parking lot. He finished his coffee on the way to the car. That story was written by Dr. Poe. Our next story is read by our reader Gurahave, and it is written in response to this prompt here. Some days I love my job. Those days are the worst.
The jury paraded back into the room in single file, eyes on the floor. Judge Prewitt, watching from his bench on high, took one look at the foreman's face and tossed his hands into the air with frustration. He did his best to stay calm, but I've known the judge for long enough to see the seething rage underneath. He'd seen hundreds of similar trials, and by now he knew all the signs. He could tell when a defendant was guilty, and he could also tell when they'd gotten away with it. Today was one of those days. The foreman stood, and the crowd waited with bated breath. "On all 11 counts of first-degree murder," he said, reading from the wrinkled slip of paper in his palm, "we find the defendant not guilty." I let out an exultant fist pump and suppressed the urge to shout. From the back of the room, the doors banged open as reporters stampeded into the hall, trying to be the first to deliver the news to their editors. The rest of the crowd, mainly family members of the victims, stood and shouted, hurling every curse and epithet that they could at the judge, the jury, my client, me, the prosecutor, anyone in sight, really. Pruitt futilely pounded his gavel, trying to restore order. Samuel remained in a zen-like state of calm. Even when the jury pronounced the verdict in his favor, he didn't even smile. Just a slow nod, more of an acknowledgement of their decision than a celebration of his freedom. His hands remained clasped in his lap, not that he had many other options with the handcuffs. But still, most clients tend to at least do something when they learn that they've avoided the death penalty. The prosecutor slipped a folder back into his briefcase and stormed out, not even waiting for the rest of the proceedings or the pronouncement from the judge. I'd probably find him out on the courthouse steps holding an impromptu press conference, ranting to the media about this travesty of justice. How could the jury have ignored so much evidence? The bloodstains found in the trunk. How well his face matched the description from the one surviving witness. How his furnace had conveniently been burning ever since the police first attempted to raid his home without a warrant. Luckily, he had gotten the good sense to call me before letting them in. The bailiff approached and relieved Samuel of his shackles. He thanked the man in a pleasant tone, but the bailiff only growled in response and returned to his position. The judge issued his final statement through his clenched teeth and adjourned the proceedings. "I appreciate your work," Samuel told me with a firm handshake. "Hopefully, I won't need your services again," he said. I didn't take this as a sign that he had changed his ways, only that he would be more careful in the future. He had certainly committed the crime. I had no doubts about that. Not guilty was the perfect verdict for him, because he absolutely felt no remorse for what he had done. In my interviews with him, he almost seemed proud of his crimes. But the ones who are definitely not innocent are always the biggest challenge. And I love a good challenge. That's the whole reason I'd taken his case to begin with. He exited the courtroom, ignoring the hisses from the crowd. Maybe he was already planning his next attack. Some days, I love my job. Those days are the worst.
That story was written by Luna Lovewell. Our final story for the day comes from a response from the exclusive podcast prompt from last episode. And to recall, that prompt was the most unusual profession you can think of. Write about your workday. Thank you so much to all those who submitted responses to the prompt. In the end, we decided to go with Castriff's story, and that story is right here, right now. Enjoy. Thank you, Castriff. The man walked into the office carrying a small leather briefcase. Mary looked up from her computer and smiled as the man closed the door behind him. "You must be James Monroe. It's very nice to meet you." "Well, thank you for meeting me." His voice was muted, not in a sad way, but quiet, contemplative. He sat slowly, then looked around the room. His eyes were like those of a child lost in a public park. "I assume this is your first time coming to an unemployment office?" "Yes." "Well, don't worry, Mr. Monroe. You're in good hands here." She straightened the file of her previous client and set it back inside her desk. "And I might say it is terrific that you made this appointment so soon after losing your previous job. It speaks volumes about your work ethic. I can tell we won't have any trouble finding a job for you." James's face brightened. He had a terrific smile, Mary thought to herself. Many of her clients were the type to lose all hope when they were fired, and would come in dressed in sweatpants and Cheetos dust as though they'd lost a longtime girlfriend instead of a job. James wore a dark suit, well pressed, with a white pocket square sitting over his left breast. He looked to be the epitome of a good worker. "To business, then," she said. "Have you brought a copy of your resume?" "Of course." "May I see it?" James was already fishing it out of his briefcase. He handed Mary a single letter-sized piece of white paper. Mary took it from him and turned it over to read. On the paper were only 3 words: James Monroe, banker. She looked up. James was staring at her expectantly and grinning. "Well, what happens first?" "Is this some sort of joke?" Mary slid the paper back across the table. "Here I thought you were really eager to find a new occupation." "I am." James seemed genuinely concerned. "What's wrong?" "This isn't a resume. It's only 3 words long. You won't get hired sending this to any employer in the country." "Oh." James's shoulders sagged. If this was a joke, he was a very convincing actor. How could a man so handsome and well-dressed not know how to make a simple list of their skills? Mary made a decision. "All right, Mr. Monroe, this isn't the first time I've had to help someone build a resume. I'll help you." He sighed. "You will?" "Of course." She turned to her computer. "We do offer resume writing classes, of course, but those are so impersonal." He chuckled. He had a great laugh as well. "Tell me about your previous jobs." James straightened and ran a hand over his tie and thought. "Well, I was a banker." She would have to prod him a little. That was fine. She could look into those gorgeous blue eyes all day. "Of course you were a banker. What I mean is, what were your responsibilities? Were you a manager?" "Well, yes, at one point, I managed the entire West Coast Division." He stared at the ceiling. "It was back-breaking work, very demanding." Mary frowned. "What do you mean, back-breaking?" "Well, it took a lot of energy. My team and I would work sometimes 16-hour days maintaining the banks at the beaches of California." "What?" "Of course, those weren't the only banks we worked on. We also preserved the banks of the Sacramento River on a side contract." A lazy smile traced across his lips as he spoke. "Those were the good days. Even when we had to stack up the sandbags in the middle of flood season, we were always in a good mood, you know?" "No, Mr. Monroe, I don't know." Mary narrowed her eyes. "What on earth does this have to do with banks?" "It has everything to do with banks. River banks, coal mine banks, banks on the sea floor." You mean geological banks?" "Yes, exactly." He grinned again. "Well," Mary stuttered, "you can understand that isn't the first thing that comes to mind when I hear the word bank." "Oh, of course, I apologize." He put a hand on his heart. "That's not the only banking I've done. I've also been a consultant for several aeronautics and automobile companies." Mary breathed. Finally, something normal. "Tell me about that, then." "Well, there's usually not much to it. They're usually very simple turns." "Turns? What?" "Yes, turns. Normally I banked planes more than cars. I would take over whenever the plane needed to move in a different direction. Really, it's not all that complicated." "So, you were a pilot?" "No, just a banker. Piloting a plane is way outside my area of expertise." "But how could you learn to turn a plane but not pilot one?" James shrugged. His smile was becoming more and more irritating by the second. "What about cars? You said you drove cars?" "No, I don't drive them, just bank them." "That's impossible! Don't you have a driver's license?" "I have a banker's license." Mary's eye twitched involuntarily. James continued, oblivious to her bewilderment. "Then there's the lower tier, the organizational aspect of the job. Banks of organ keys, banks of elevator cars, banks of mailboxes and apartment buildings." "But what about finance?" Mary slammed her fist on the table. "When I hear the word bank, I think of finance, stocks, treasurers, investment firms. What about those?" "I ran the bank for a Monopoly game once or twice." It was enough to make Mary scream. She chose to whimper instead and put her head into her hands. She suddenly had a massive headache. "What's wrong?" "Those are not jobs, Mr. Monroe. No one gets paid for those forms of banking." "You must be mistaken. I was paid quite well for those assignments." Her voice was bitter. "In real money or Monopoly money?" "Both?" "Get out," she hissed. What? Get out! And don't come back until you have an actual job to put on your resume. Go on, get out! James sat still until Mary balled up the resume in her hands and threw it at his face. He stood up, picked up his briefcase, and left without a word. Mary put her elbows on the table and massaged her temples, trying to calm down. The phone rang. Mary picked up the extension to hear her secretary on the other end. Mary, would you like me to send in the next client? Ask him what his job was first. What? Just ask him! Mary could hear the secretary place her hand over the phone's receiver, then lifted it. He said he's a driver. Does he have a driver's license? A valid one? Another pause. Looks valid to me. Mary, are you okay? I'm fine, just send him in. Mary hung up before the secretary could say anything. After a few seconds, the new client walked in with a golf bag strapped to his chest. Inside the golf bag were 7 identical silver golf clubs. They were drivers. Mary began to cry. All right, thank you again to Castriff for submitting that story. Every episode, we have an exclusive prompt that I'm going to share with you right now. And if you want to have your story read on the show, just write a response at prompted.reddit.com. You'll see it right at the top. And the prompt for next episode is this: the real reason people have freckles. So once again, go to prompted.reddit.com and you'll see that prompt at the top there. Click on it, write a story, and you too could be featured on the show. These exclusive prompts come from Ryan Kinder's book, 1000 Awesome Writing Prompts. You can check it out on Amazon.com. It is full of amazing, awesome prompts. If you just can't get enough of them and want to become a better writer, check it out. All right, that is the end of the show. Thank you so much for joining with us, and thank you to all the writers that have contributed to today's episode. Thank you so much to Gurahave for lending your voice to the show once more. This show is produced, edited, and hosted by myself, Hunter Christensen. In an upcoming episode, I have a big surprise for you guys that I'm very excited for. I know the interviews have fallen by the wayside, but no more. I'm going to have an awesome guest, and that is all I'm going to say about it. In the meantime, have an awesome couple weeks and stay creative.